Tonight's topic, improving digital skills in Canadian nonprofits. We'll be hearing from Viet Vu, a manager of economic research at the Dais, a public policy and leadership think tank at Toronto Metropolitan University, working at the intersection of technology, education, and democracy to build shared prosperity and citizenship for Canada. And he's got a really impressive bio on the Dais website. So let's have a big round of applause for Viet.
No, thanks, Thomas, and the entire team for putting this together. And I'm assuming I can just do that. Great. Wonderful how technology works. So again, especially for the people in the back, people online currently have a pretty big advantage right now. In a couple of slides, you'll see a really dense one with lots of small text. And so I'm just warning you, if you actually want to read it, lots of seat out front, please do populate it. I will walk through it. But to sort of begin this conversation, and I think, okay, that's showing up properly there. Great. I thought I would just quickly go through exactly who we are. And the first thing that you might notice is that there are a lot of logos on that. And that is because this project that I'm going to talk to you about has been a long time coming. I think we started submitting the grant application for this way back in like February of 2022. To the federal government, and they said that they would let us know about the outcome, and it's in fall of 2022. What we didn't realize that when the federal government said fall of 2022, it meant July of 2023, and so time seems to move fairly differently in Ottawa compared to Toronto. But this massive project that has really taken a course of over 3 years now, that's just been extended for the 4th year, has not been possible without our big partners. So there's Imagine Canada, who many of you might know as one of the industry associations of the nonprofit sector, Blueprint ADE, which is also a company that especially help with doing evidence generation in supporting the nonprofit sector, as well as the Digital Governance Council, who's been often at the forefront of many conversations about sort of digital maturity and digital adoption for the social impact space. But what this project is we were really interested to figure out why it was that a lot of conversations on sort of digital maturity and digital adoption left out the community impact sector. There seem to have been a lot of conversations happening in the private sector about, banks adopting AI. There seems to also have been a lot of conversation about the public sector, government adopting different kinds of technology, spaces like this. But we actually realized that there aren't as many, at least, comparative spaces that exist for the nonprofit and community impact sector. And we realized that a lot of the conversation that we are having about public sector digital maturity were actually going to be fairly useful. But this whole project, therefore, was really meant to actually fill that gap in both understanding the unique sort of digital needs of the nonprofit and community impact sector, as well as actually figuring out the unique constraints that it faces, of which you might not be surprised funding is one of them, which is what I'm going to talk about in a tiny bit, to then actually lead to actionable sort of pilots and prototypes, one of which I'm actually going to present to you. The big disclaimer here is that I was involved in that grade out 1 and 2 mainly, but some of the folks who are much more involved in this sort of orange and the purple phase, which is the part that I'm going to talk about, weren't able to make it out today. And so huge credits for a lot of stuff I'm stealing and plagiarizing tonight from Alberta, Max, and Barbara. So those are the 3 folks, especially from Blueprint, who work countless hours to actually perfect this model that I'm going to talk to you about today. So this is literally the only slide that I can claim full credit for, because the beginning stages of this project involve us actually doing a snapshot study of the current sort of technology talent that exist within nonprofits, as well as understanding the demand for various different digital tools and digital skills, especially in validating some of our assumptions. And so these are the assumptions that we were able to validate. The first one is that nonprofits just don't have a lot of financial resources and are often too small to be able to actually hire dedicated technology staff or IT departments. And oftentimes what we found out is that a lot of sort of that frontline staff that exist that actually serve community members were also data entry clerks, were also data analysts, were also their like own like actual IT support, whatever the equipment, the laptop were going to break down. And so one of the assumptions that we have to make if we actually want any of our intervention that we are going to do to improve the digital maturity level at nonprofit sector had to be that we were going to rely a lot more on existing internal non-technical talent rather than charting a path that says, hey, you need to spend $150K budget to hire a developer that knows Python when, let's say, your frontline staff is only making $60K a year. That wasn't going to land. And then the second thing we also realized was that, look, the reality is digital capacity and digital maturity of the nonprofit sector does not need to be at the frontier model. They do not need to run a server with the latest, NVIDIA GPU in order to train massive, massive frontier models. A lot of the times, it was actually about identifying things like, oh, are there things that you're using Excel for that you can actually upload to the cloud? Are there things that you're doing in Word document that you can actually do in Excel instead? And so a lot of the stuff that we ended up focusing on was actually specifically data collection sort of processes that exist at nonprofit sector and how to improve it, which we'll sort of talk about a tiny bit. And the third thing is that solutions will also need to be led by the organizational context. And what this means is that, again, acknowledging the reality that there isn't a huge amount of financial resources in the nonprofit sector, a lot of technologies, products that exist currently on the market just were not designed necessarily to solve the needs that exist at nonprofits, especially when it comes to privacy, especially when it comes to people's data security. A lot of these solutions just didn't meet the needs because it wasn't designed to solve those needs. And so a lot of the times, a lot of technologies needed to be hacked, but you couldn't necessarily start with the technology. Obviously, you can't in a lot of contexts, but this was especially true in the nonprofit and community impact sector, is that you have to start from what the organization was doing to try to figure out of the existing technologies that exist, which would be the most appropriate, even though the reality and the recognition was that not anything was perfectly applicable to it. And so with that in mind, we developed a whole set of prototypes. There are 4 of them. We'll only have time to really go in deep on one of them, but just wanted to show you the entire range. The first thing is that we developed a tool so that organizations can actually identify the digital skill needs across different roles that exist within their organization. The second thing, which we're going to go into, and so I'm going to talk about that in a tiny bit. The third prototype we developed was a framework to allow sort of highly capable staff that exist. There's always a technology with whether that be a younger intern or someone who is just very curious about technology in an organization, and a framework to allow those folks to be able to mentor and upskill other folks at the organization. And then finally, there's also huge amounts for a lot of nonprofits and community impact sector work with extremely vulnerable population to specifically focus on sort of improving the capacity at the organization level to deal with issues around data privacy and data security. But the key part that we're going to go deep into is actually figuring out how to improve data management practices and processes, which was one of the low-hanging fruits, if you will, that we had identified during the initial validation period, that a lot of nonprofits recognized the need to collect huge amounts of data, that it was going to be beneficial, and yet lack the capacity to do so. And so that's sort of the deep dive that we're going to go into the second prototype. That's a thing I warned you about. There's a lot of text in there. I'm not going to sort of pause here to make you read all of it because we're going to go through it one by one. So this model really has about 2.5 steps to it, because really, if you come back to it, that last step is like, oh, you win. Here are all the things that you benefit after you follow through the process. And so we're going to start with the first step, which really involves something that I think many of you were going to be familiar with, which is to create a user story mapping exercise. This is sort of as quote unquote neutral as an example that we can come up with. The process of waking up and the data you collect while you're waking up. But as you can imagine, this process can be created for any kind of sort of social service provision. One example, which I'm weirdly familiar with because I worked at many of them, let's say, think back, unfortunately, no one wants to, at the time during COVID, where we were all lining up to get our vaccine doses. A lot of community organizations were actually working really hard to go from the step of taking in client, ensuring that data matches, ensuring that the medical questionnaires were filled out and the medical screenings were passed, to then actually administering the vaccine, issuing the receipt for the fact that there was a vaccine, and having collected data so that if there are follow-up appointments, second doses, third doses, that they would be able to have enough data to identify the same client so that you don't accidentally deny someone service or give someone a dosage of the vaccine that is medically unsafe. And so there's many different steps in these process. You divide that in sort of 3 layers. The first layer is talking about the actual users. Who's involved in each of these interactions throughout this process? What's actually doing the action? Sometimes it's a technical thing. It could be, an iPad that is like actually sending the data and receiving data from somewhere. It could be an actual staff member that is collecting this data. What is the exact action that this entity that is taking the action doing in this sort of service process? Then within the vaccine example, it would be, oh, you're first greeting it, you're checking for the health card, and then you're inputting their health ID if they have an OHIP card, or you are inputting their date of birth, you might be inputting their name, all of these other search sort of fields that exist. Or if they're a new client, then you would also be asking people to provide enough information so that they're identifiable. And then finally, the data that is actually being collected at what point. And so the point of this exercise here is to really elucidate and make clear who's doing it, what is happening, and what data is being collected. And the goal here is really to identify all of the bottlenecks that might exist and also all the opportunities that you can take advantage of as well. So after you've done that, you go into this expansive middle layer. Again, I'm going to go through it one by one. There's sort of 3 steps to it that can happen concurrently, probably shouldn't happen concurrently. This was just to fit it in a letter size page that we mashed that second step into a single thing. But the second step is sort of a whole bunch of exercises in synthesizing and actually figuring out what it means for the data that you're collecting at the nonprofit context. So that involves practical data inventory exercise. What is being collected? What data fields? Is it numerical? Is it character? Literally, so this tool, we designed like a self-guided questionnaire that actually create a data sort of model cards, if you will. The data, I'm blanking on the term. The data attribute card, there we are. That essentially lists all of the meta-level data, meta-level information about the data itself. There's also a data quality assessment. Is there particular places in the process where you actually realize that you're correcting the wrong information? Or if there are places in which is especially prone to error. Let's say someone who might not speak English or French, and therefore you're actually misunderstanding their name, spelling of their name, if there need to be special characters in recording their name, stuff like that. And then finally, the data security self-assessment, which again, all of these are self-guided. I kind of remind us that. The data security assessment is about like, who has access, what has access, where is the data actually going, in ensuring that whatever data is collected is in fact safe and secure. The middle bit. Now that we've kind of looked at the existing process as is, you now understand exactly the data that you're collecting, you kind of understand the quality of the stuff that you are collecting, and then you also understand the security aspect of the data that you're collecting. You now move on to talk about the process itself. The 3 sort of words that exist that we've sort of developed here is the idea of efficiency, effectiveness, and uniformity. Not going to spend a lot of time defining those, happy to answer questions, but this really is about like looking at the process that you mapped out to then identify bottlenecks and also opportunities in streamlining it and improving it. And the key important aspect of this step is you need to be documenting. the actual discussions and the decisions that you made in what you're going to do to actually improve this process. To then lead to the final step of this, which is actually talking about the organizational capacity building. So within this is about skills needs. Now that you've mapped out your process, now that you've identified both the current level of data collection, what you want that data to end up being, and then second, hopefully identify the actual streamlining of the process itself, comes everyone's favorite part, who's actually going to do it, who's actually responsible for implementing this. And this is a step where we've kind of made that first validated assumption really important, that we kind of often have to work with the existing talent at the organization. And so through these sort of initial two steps, what you would have likely ended up with were a series of tasks, whether that be tasks that you need to improve the process itself or new tasks that needs to be part of the process, but that doesn't have anyone responsible yet. We want to be able to first assign those tasks to staff roles that exist in the organization. And then that will lead us to, okay, person A is going to be responsible for task X. Person B is going to be responsible for task Y. The second step out of this process, now that we understood which person is responsible for what task, is you start grouping tasks by common skills. It turns out this task X and task Y has very different skills, which is you need to know Excel. Now that you know who's responsible for each task sort of groupings, you can then create a tailored sort of learning environment that says, oh, hey, we actually need two different sort of digital upskilling sort of resources of programming for two groupings of tasks that different staff need to do. And person A, because they're only responsible for the task within the space, as long as you know Excel, you're going to be okay. They only need to take that training. But person B, in addition to having to take this Excel training, because they're also responsible for performing this task that require, let's say, I don't know, Photoshop skills, even though that would be a wild thing. But I'm saying that because I, for some reason, do both data analysis and have an Adobe Creative license. But in addition to having to take the Excel training, they would also need to take a Photoshop training as well. And so this way, you're really finding the lowest common denominator in understanding the set of digital trainings that you need to actually end up at the organizational process that you need and the data that you need collected. Through that, that's sort of the third step that I just described in talking about assessing existing staff skills and create upskilling plans. And then really the final step is profit, even though I don't think nonprofit sectors can actually profit. But that last bit is really about the end goal. So this was a super quick overview. And we actually tested this process. There's a slide in the appendix about what we found in terms of how people reacted to this specific prototype that I'm happy to go through. But I mean, that's kind of about what I had, because I know this space is about like actually doing things instead of sitting on a chair and listening to people talk. There are two QR codes there on one that lead us to our actual main website. The actual sort of prototype materials is not going to be online until June, because you saw that timeline I presented. Once it's set, it's going to be on that website. The report that folks at Blueprint has worked on to sort of map out the specific prototype and actually report the feedback that was provided by many wonderful sort of design partners and nonprofit partners. That's going to be the QR code on the right. There we are, this report one. But yeah, apart from that, we're now moving on to appendix, but I'm curious about whether you have any questions, which I'm sure you do because I didn't tell you that much. Thank you.
Well, thank you. We can open it up to questions. Does anyone have questions in the room? Oh, yes.
Thank you for the presentation. I was just wondering, when you talked about existing staff needing to upskill and be assigned tasks for the digitalization. I was just wondering, have you encountered situations where there's a risk of overburdening employees that are existing there and assigning them too much on top of their already high workloads?
Yeah, 100%. And this is something that we encounter a lot of. For nonprofit workers and sort of community impact workers are already dealing with an increasing amount of workload. Many of the workers that we sort of talk to and approach, we're often talking about the fact that they have not recovered fully from the pandemic and the burnout of that. And so I think that's a true reality. And so on one of the sessions and workshop that we led with many leaders within this area, we are essentially talking about the fact that there is a trade-off, which comes from the fact that in order to do this, you kind of have to create a dedicated time that takes away from, let's say, the direct provision of services, that takes away from other necessary priorities to prioritize this. But again, there was that much bigger constraint of the fact that not really a lot of people were funding dedicated grants to focus on organizational infrastructure, which again is fairly unique to the nonprofit sector. And that was sort of that really thin needles that we had to thread, but definitely acknowledging that concern. And we've heard that concern a lot throughout this process.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I'm wondering, have you tried this process with an organization? What kind of organization? How did it go?
Yeah, that's great because ta-da! Oh, ta-da! That is exactly what you do when you think that there's going to be a question and you try to direct a presentation so that that question comes up and then you have a perfect slide for it. We have, in fact, tested this specific process with a lot of people, and we actually did a survey to it. And so you can see some of the numbers. It's very small. Again, online folks have a lot more advantage here. But 71% agreed that the instructions were clear. 86% actually understood the intended outcome. 86% agreed that the prototype was easy for team members to use. And remarkably, 100%, all of the groups that we tested, and these are actual nonprofit, thought that the process was actually really useful for them in figuring out their data needs and improving it. 86% agreed that completing the prototype was, in fact, a good use of their time. 14% of the people probably thought that, why do I need another Zoom call? Or they would rather be on patio, which is entirely fair to them. But their feedback in actually improving it was also very helpful as well. Again, remarkable on the fact that 100% of the groups and people that we tested this with gained a better understanding of their data. 100% felt more confident tackling data-related problems. And so at least we think it's a pretty successful one. I think the only part where we suffered a tiny bit, as you can see that last number there, only about 70% felt that they gained a better understanding of the digital skills need. And I think that was straight up because digital skills is often a extremely nebulous concept. One of my favorite examples talks about is social media digital skill. You certainly use sort of digital tools and digital platforms to do your job well, but a lot of what you do is traditional marketing, communications, and public affairs. So is that a digital skill? And so I think that nebulousness was where we also saw some barriers that we're certainly hoping to figure out how to solve in iterations of this.
Okay. Thank you for the presentation. My question kind of revolves around what you were mentioning earlier in the presentation on kind of how there aren't as many technologies that benefit the not-for-profit sector, and a lot of it is really to develop the private sector and serve their needs. Do you know if there are, and I guess it's out of the scope of this project, but do you know if there are other initiatives that are trying to get more investment to support not-for-profits and they don't make a profit, so it's hard for them to kind of invest in their own technologies. But do you have any ideas on how that can be improved?
Yeah, it's a really great question. In my mind, there are sort of three existing ways in which that happens. The first way that happens is open source projects. Open source project has always been made by technologists for the public good. And so, in fact, you realize that open source projects are primed for really nonprofit and community impact sector to use. The only thing, though, is because sort of open source projects are often made by technologists. They don't necessarily have the right investment into things like UI or UX for non-technologists to seamlessly use the tools that get created. And so that, I think, is one way in which that happens. And so would be lucky if the organization has a technologist that can then use sort of open source tool to create. The second way it happens is, quite frankly, through private sector CSRs, community social responsibility. A lot of tech companies do have discounted sort of versions of their software for nonprofits. The only sort of criticism here is that that only really exists at scale-ups and fairly established tech companies. Startups, quite frankly, what many will end up saying is that we just can't focus on that right now. That would be a nice to have. So that's the second way through which that happens. Third way is essentially through pooling of resources. And so there's one organization which I think is on here for their part of it, because they're part of Imagine, the Canadian Centre for Nonprofit Digital Resiliency, which is again meant to be this sort of convening groups that pulls resources together that actually negotiate group licenses. And so often this, I think the most successful example of this, for example, is First Work, which is an association of sort of workforce developers that essentially negotiated with LinkedIn to have a whole bunch of LinkedIn learning licenses, at least my understanding, so that many sort of workforce developers who are working to transition people structurally disrupted have access to the best sort of like learning tools that exist. And so that's the third way which happens currently, which are pooling of resources. But again, the criticism, not necessarily criticism, but the trade-off there is that you aren't taking from a huge pool of existing resource, unfortunately, financial resources, which is scarce. And so there are challenges there as well. But that's sort of three ways in which I currently see that happen.
We're a little ahead of schedule, about 5 minutes left. It looks like we have no questions so far online, but any questions, take advantage of in the room?
I was wondering if you could speak to how work like this might drive improved social impacts and public value, or and also in reducing risks and kind of novel and emerging issues that are involved with digital technology.
Yeah, I'll sort of address the first one. So the question, for those in the room who couldn't hear as much, was how this work can connect to actual improved levels of public outcomes and social outcomes. And the second was about how you can sort of use this in helping prepare organizations that emerge in risks and issues. Have I paraphrased? All right. On the first, I mean, my answer is pretty simple, right? We like organizations that achieve good things to be really good at the thing that they do. And ultimately, this process and all of the processes that many in this space is working on is aiming to improve and allow these organizations to do a really good job at the work that they do. And look, if I'm being entirely honest, if I, my actual opinion is that there should be way less of a stigma in terms of the ability to pay people appropriately in the nonprofit and community impact sectors. But the social opinion on that is not sort of in support of that right now. My opinion ultimately is that the way to attract the best talent remain to be able to compensate them properly. And so there is that constraint. And so oftentimes I think one of my favorite economists, Nathan Nunn, he's a developmental economist, economic historian, often talk about the fact that us economists and researchers often focus on improvements at the margin. We say, hey, we have all of these constraints. Can we just improve things marginally, 1 to 5%, and that's a big win already. And that's kind of what this work is designed to do. Now, we can just pay people better. We can actually have a funding structure that prioritizes, that actually has two streams, one that prioritizes infrastructure funding at nonprofits, and then another that prioritizes sort of programmatic things. All of that will probably end up like doing a much better job at allowing for higher social value to be created. But I do believe that our thing works, but again, it exists at the margin is sort of the constraint of that. On the second thing, precisely because of the fact that it exists at the margin, quite frankly, I don't think this tool will be very helpful if your goal is to help an organization assess emerging risks. Because this really is about the low-hanging fruits that exist. This really is about, hey, here's the process that we are currently following right now. And look, there are some sort of questionnaires and processes like the data security and privacy assessment that will guide you through some of the stuff that you may not know about that might be at the frontier of these kinds of stuff. Like, oh, how do you protect this against phishing attacks? How do you protect this against sort of socio-technical attacks as opposed to purely technical attacks? But this tool isn't inherently designed to actually prepare organization to deal with like sort of massive X risk. Things like, oh, what happens if Trump invades Canada tomorrow? It's just not designed for that. So.
Well, thank you very much, Viet. And if you are open to it, if we could have a breakout room afterwards and you can continue the
Is
conversation.
the breakout room in a patio?
We'll see what we can do. All right,
Thank
round of
you.
applause for Viet.